Hey, PSY230 students. It's time for our week 2 check-in video. So first thing I wanted to do was just go over, kind of wrap last week up, or our first week, because it looked like the vast majority of you were able to finish all the assignments and also do exam number 1. And so I just wanted to go over a couple things with regard to exam 1. First, and it's partly just a suggestion, is that a number of you did not submit any of your work for the exam. So I can give you partial credit for the computational questions if you submit work. So there were a few students who I would say their scores could have been, probably at least 10 points higher if they had submitted their work. So if you just, any math that's involved in any of the computational questions, just do the math on a piece of paper. Write the formulas out. It'll end up being worth points on these exams. So please do that, because there were definitely some students that didn't, and I think would have had decently higher scores. But in general, I thought people did well. Let me kind of show you what we have for right now. It looks like we've got about 15 people who have taken the test so far. And the average score on the test, as you can see here, is a 91.1. The median score is 92.2. So this means half of you scored above 92, half of you scored below 92. The mode, most frequently occurring score, was 100. Actually, I think we had 6 people with a perfect score of 100. Standard deviation is right now 9.7. So the average was 91.1, and people deviated from that by about 9.7 points. So to think about your own deviation, just take your score and subtract it by 91.1. Whatever that result is your deviation. Some of you will have deviations that are positive because you were above the mean. Some of you will have deviations that are negative because you were below the mean. And so when we average everyone's deviations and essentially ignore the positive and negative deviations, because positive is above, negative is below, we end up with a standard or average deviation of 9.7. Variance is 94, and variance is just the average squared deviation. So if you squared 9.7, it would be 94. But now you can see hopefully how 9.7 is actually interpretable kind of more directly, because you kind of have a sense that, people, scored within about 9.7 points of the mean on average. But to know that they scored within 94 squared deviations on average, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Both are great measures of spread, but the standard deviation is much more interpretable as a descriptive statistic. Range was 28.9, so if you just take the highest score of 100 and divide it by, or subtract it by 71.1, which was the lowest percentage score, you end up with a 28.9. Skewness here is a negative 0.861. This just simply means that there was a negative skew. So if we look at our histogram here, we can see a lot of, again, highest number was a lot of 100s, and then you've got, a fair number in the low 90s, and then you've got a smattering in the 80s and a smattering in the 70s. And so there's kind of this tail over here to the left. That's an indication that this is a negative skew. So just so just to kind of see what Jamovi gives us, here's, as you kind of practice with your descriptive statistics deep dive, here's a box plot. So basically, as we go back up here, the mean was 91.1, the median is 92.2. So this line right here is the median. This line right here is the 75th percentile. That line right there is the 25th percentile. So if you subtracted the difference in those two scores, you would get the interquartile range. And then you can see there's a dot there. That's where the mean is. So you can see that the mean is a little bit lower because the mean is getting pulled down by these other scores down here. And then you can kind of barely see them in here, but there are dots for everybody's scores. And then finally, yeah, that's pretty much it as far as how people did. So one thing that's just, I always like to talk about with the exams, what's going to be carried forward. Calculating means and standard deviations, definitely important. We aren't going to really use frequency tables all that much from this point on. So if you struggled with that, you're probably going to be okay going forward. You don't really need to clear that up. But if you're struggling at all with calculating means and standard deviations, sum of squares, variation, you're going to want to make sure you have that pretty down pat because they're going to be used a lot in the rest of the class. Okay, so then shifting to this coming week, so week 2, I will say it's during this week that things start to get a little bit more challenging for most students. The first week sometimes is not so challenging because it's review for a lot of students. But now that we're shifting gears a little bit, we're going to go into some statistics and calculations that might be new for many people. Technically, this week is going to start our exploration of what's called a z-score. The z-score is a descriptive statistic, and ultimately you'll find it's a combination of both the mean and the standard deviation. So we use a mean and a standard deviation to describe a group of scores. What we're going to end up using is a z-score to locate where an individual is within that group. And that's what we're going to do in chapter 5. And so, for instance, on our exam, I could technically, for any of you, calculate a z-score. And the z-score would tell me whether your score was above or below the mean and how far above or below the mean in terms of a standard deviation. So that's ultimately what the z-score is going to give us. So we're going to learn that in chapter 5, and then we're going to learn some processes of standardization. So chapter 5 will be pretty much descriptive statistics, and most people will still be reasonably comfortable in there. But then in chapter 6 and then ultimately chapter 7, things start to get more dicey because we introduce probability. And I'll just say right off the top that probability is tough because our brains really aren't built for probability. It's about guessing, and there's no right or wrong answer in some cases, and it's just about like odds and probabilities, and it's a little difficult. Our brain likes to have real solid answers, and so it struggles in this sort of ambiguity. But so this is where things will start to get a little bit, that thing I described at the beginning of the semester is that, sometimes some of this can be like you'll do all the calculations and you'll be comfortable there, but you just won't necessarily know why. It's the probability part of it there where that starts to have that impact. So people will start to struggle a little bit more typically in chapters 6 and 7. I also tend to find that those problem sets challenge people a little bit more, so you might need to spend a little bit more time on problem sets this week than you did last week. But essentially, we're going to try to constrict what we're focused on, and we're just going to learn z-scores and then add in probability. So we're just going to do chapters 5, 6, and 7. And then we're going to have exam 2. So 6 and 7 tends to be a steeper climb. And then just so you know, next week and the next couple weeks after that, we're going to get into chapter 8. And chapter 8 is where that's the center of the class. Chapter 8 is when we're doing inferential statistics. We're going to ultimately, right now, learn the z-score as a descriptive statistic, and then we're going to use it as an inferential statistic. So it's kind of our gateway into inferential statistics. But it's when we hit chapter 8, we're going to learn this whole process of hypothesis testing, and there's just a lot of information there. So I'm going to put that off until the next exam, so that right now we can kind of learn a lot of the skills we're going to need in chapter 8. And then we'll have a couple weeks to learn chapter 8 and just chapter 9. And so from that point on, once we finish chapter 8, which I would argue is kind of the hub chapter of the entire class, then I tend to find students find that everything kind of levels out. The amount of effort and the challenge, it kind of eases out as we do the second half of the class. And that's because we're following the same system we're learning in chapter 8. And the only thing, arguably really changing are the calculations, the formulas that we use. And so people kind of get into the rhythm of it. And so they tend to find that it works a little bit better. So just be ready for this week, that it might start amping up a little bit for you. And again, we're just going to learn the z-score and start adding in probability. And we're going to initially do the z-score for individuals, and then we're going to shift in Chapter 7 to calculating z-scores for sample means, where instead of focusing on how did an individual do, we're going to focus on how did a group of people do compared to a larger group of scores. So that's where we're heading. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions, and otherwise, good luck this week.